Thomas Friedman had written a book, The World is Flat, a very aptly titled book on the subject of effect of globalization on human society. Surely globalization was evening out the hills and valleys of opportunities as the book tries to posit. In the heydays of globalization, the idea of geopolitics had taken a backstage and globalization was the focus for the whole world. But in the recent years, there has been a reversal once again. Geopolitics is back at the center. Geopolitics is nothing but politics played out on account of certain specific geographical features. If we see the recent conflicts that the world is facing, we can once again see that geopolitics is at the core of many of these. The biggest case study or the most characteristic case study is that of the Russia-Ukraine war. Certain geographical features of that region have led to this particular war according to some experts. Today in this session, we are going to try to understand one such geopolitical development in the recent past of human history. We will be talking about the first Crimean War of mid-19th century. Incidentally, it started from today's date, that is 16th of October 1853, and would be fought till 1856. The recent Ukraine war in many ways actually is a reflection of that same war, that is Crimean War of mid-19th century. We will try to locate this war in its larger context and also try to draw some parallels with today's times. Also, there are some very interesting India-related links of the first Crimean War that I'm going to share with you towards the end of this session. So stay with me till the very end. Let's dive in and get started, guys. Tim Marshall, a journalist, had written a very powerful book, Prisoners of Geography, Our World Explained in 12 Simple Maps. In this book, the author presents the case that international politics today is actually revolving around geopolitics of 12 maps. If we are able to understand the geographical features based in these maps, it is relatively easy to understand the geopolitics that emerges around it. And one such case study that he presents in this particular book is that of the great country of Russia. If we are able to understand the geography around Russia, we will be able to unravel the mind of any important Russian ruler. From Peter the Great to Putin the Great of our times today, the book would like us to believe the approach of Russian rulers has been driven by the geopolitics of that particular area. So let us dive in and try to understand what are the limitations that a ruler based in Russia always faces, and consequently how his policies cater to those limitations and challenges. So let's get started, guys, and try to understand the map over here. If you see, this part of Northern Europe has the famous North European plains that run right into Russia. Okay. Russia otherwise is secluded on its other boundaries, but this particular part, the plain as such, is very flat and can be easily accessed. You can literally cycle from Paris right up to Moscow because of this flat land or flat topography. Because of this flat topography, there is something called as the Polish funnel that is created in this manner, which makes it easy or accessible for a power from the west to intrude into Russia. This is the same idea that was used by Napoleon in the 18th century when he took 6 lakh French troops into the Russian Empire. Hitler will replicate that later in World War II with about 3 lakh odd troops. Both of them met the same fate. The Russian resolve and the harsh Russian winter got the better of them. But then the lessons were always learned. This was very well understood by anybody who came to power in Moscow or St. Petersburg. The rulers understood that they do not have natural barriers on this side, and consequently they are always vulnerable for an attack from the west. And consequently, the Russians will always want to have a buffer zone or a sphere of influence, or if possible, in medieval times, of course, to extend their territory westwards so that the core of the empire could be safe. This is a motivation that was shared by all prominent Russian rulers during the Tsarist times, starting with Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, or later Alexander the First during Napoleon's times. All of these rulers understood the importance of having a buffer zone on their western side. Furthermore, by having control on Ukraine towards the west and extending towards the Baltic Sea, extending towards the Black Sea, the Russian Empire could have access to the Mediterranean Sea also. Access to Mediterranean Sea meant access to the trade and politics of that region. Naturally, all Russian rulers wanted to advance in that direction. Access to that region also opened up potentialities for access to Persian Gulf via West Asia. And Persian Gulf was the door for reaching towards India too. And many of these rulers had the ambition of reaching out towards India, either via Black Sea, West Asia, or via Central Asia. In fact, guys, perhaps you will be surprised to know that Peter the Great, one of the greatest rulers of the Russians, he had advised his descendants, and he said it in so many words: approach as near as possible to Constantinople and India. Approach as near as possible to Constantinople and India. Whoever governs there will be true sovereign of the world. Consequently, excite continual wars not only in Turkey but in Persia, penetrate as far as the Persian Gulf and advance as far as India. This is the Russian ruler at the start of 18th century. He's saying this to his future descendants, to people who will sit on the throne of Russia. Consequently, we will see that Russians will have a concerted policy of advancing towards Constantinople and towards Central Asia. This map will make you understand this even better. Starting out as a small, you can say, territory around Moscow or Muscovite territory, you will see the Russians went on expanding in outward spheres. So much so that in the 19th century, you can see over here, they are knocking here at the Pamirs. They're knocking at the Pamirs. Here, they are knocking on the doors of the Ottomans. Black Sea virtually had become a lake for the Russians around mid-19th century. This expansions by Russians was seen with grave concern by other rival European powers, particularly Britain and France. Britain was greatly concerned about Russian advance towards India. After losing America in the 18th century, Britain was very certain that it did not want to lose its crown jewel at any cost, that is India. Any power who had some sort of interest towards India was always seen with great contempt or great hatred by the Britishers. In the 18th century, the French, and later in 19th century, there will be the Russian threat to India. Throughout the 19th century, there will be an idea called as the Great Game that will be played out between British Empire and the Russian Empire. Russian Empire trying to advance via Central Asia through the Khanates over here, small Muslim principalities being annexed by the Russians, and the Britishers trying to get Afghanistan under their control to have a buffer zone against the advancing Russians. This rivalry between the two was known as the Great game between Russian and British empires. Afghanistan became locked between these two powers, and two mighty wars will be fought by the Britishers to gain control over Afghanistan. So this is the larger geopolitics, guys, of this region. Parallelly around this time, the once very powerful Ottoman Empire was also slowly declining. The Ottoman Empire, which had spread over 3 continents, parts of Europe, parts of Asia, and also the northern parts of Africa, that Ottoman Empire had slowly started to fold back. From the 18th century itself, it was losing territory in Europe, then subsequently in other parts of its empire. By the time it is mid-19th century, the Russians start to refer to it as the sick man of Europe. The Tsar himself had used this term for Ottoman Turkey. He had told other European powers, Britain particularly, that this sick man is going to die anytime soon, and before he dies, if we don't distribute his property, then it will lead to conflict later. And therefore, he was of the view that Russian territories, Ottoman territories, should be partitioned amongst other rival European powers. The British, of course, were not happy about this idea because they wanted to prevent Russian expansion in this direction. Russians desperately wanted warm water ports. Warm water ports was one strategic thing that the Russians lacked then, and they, to a great extent, lack today also. And because of that, Russian Empire could not play that significant an impact on the international politics of the 19th century. By advancing towards Constantinople, Russia hoped that it would get access to Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, and from there onwards towards Mediterranean Sea, and will have some warm water ports in this area. This was the whole game plan. Naturally, the Britishers, ever the prescient, ever the visionary, they did not want Russians, a powerful player, to become competitors here, especially since they could then go onwards towards India also. So this is the larger conflict that we see in this particular period. Because of this conflict, 19th century history will be dominated by a question which is called as the Eastern question by historians. This Eastern question is like that conundrum, paheli as we call in Hindi, of 19th and early 20th century Europe, which will lead to constant conflict and tension. What was this Eastern question, if we may summarize it? The Eastern question was the issue of political and economic instability in the Ottoman Empire. Political and economic instability in Ottoman Empire from late 18th to early 20th centuries. Because of this instability, there was a strategic competition and political considerations of European grade powers. This decline of the Ottomans led to rising interest of other European powers in this region, Russia being the foremost. Russia wanted to profit at the cost of this weakening Ottoman Empire, whereas others wanted to prevent advancement of Russia in this direction. This led to a series of conflicts, and the World War I also in some ways will be a byproduct of this same conflict. This is referred to as the Eastern question. The Crimean War was an important episode of this same Eastern question. What were the characteristics of this Eastern question? Ottoman Turkey, by now the sick man of Europe, was constantly losing wars to rival European powers. Once a nemesis of the Christian Europe up to 17th century, from mid-18th century onwards, we will see the Ottomans will be a declining power. It was only their military genius and the politics of Europe that had kept it alive, otherwise it was tottering to its fall. Ottoman institutional insolvency or its financial condition had become very untenable. The state had taken many loans from many different powers also, and which it was not able to repay back because of inefficiency in its functioning. Ottoman political and economic modernization program was also going into doldrums. In the 19th century, Ottomans will realize that they are backward as compared to rest of Europe. So they will slowly start to reform themselves. But then a society that was steeped in conservatism and a state that wanted to take it towards modernism, these two could not be reconciled and the outcome was not a happy one. This led to a lot of conflict in the Ottoman society, which made it even more weak. The rise of ethno-religious nationalism in its provinces. 19th century is the century of rise of nationalism. Taking cue from rest of Europe, many of these regions, especially in Europe, of the Ottoman Empire, they started to rise up with religious and ethnic nationalism. The Greeks, the Serbs, and many others, they rose up to fight against the brutal Ottoman regime. And in this process, we will see many of them will also win their independence. Serbia around 1804, Greece around the 1830s was able to wrest its independence from the Ottomans. Many of the outlying provinces, they also had managed to gain substantial autonomy from the center, thereby weakening the Ottoman hold over them. Great powers were also interested in this declining age of the Ottomans. They wanted to profit at the cost of fall of the Ottomans, which seemed now imminent. All of this made the situation extremely fatal for the Ottomans and very attractive towards other European powers. The fragile balance of power system that was created after end of Napoleon was now being threatened once again. Congress of Vienna had tried to establish balance of power in 1815 between different European powers so that there wouldn't be recurrence of warfare as during Napoleon's times. But with Ottomans declining and Russians trying to expand at their cost, this balance of power was becoming more and more fragile by the day. In this context, guys, we will see that the Crimean War will have to be fought. Let us now try to understand the specific background of Crimean War itself. France and Britain want to prevent rise of Russia at any cost. Although both of them are arch enemies, they have been fighting for centuries. They have fought in recent decades also. Nevertheless, France and Britain are united over this common geopolitical interest to prevent another rival, Russia, to rise in, towards the western areas of Europe. Post-Napoleonic Wars, the balance of power that was created was being threatened by Russia, and this had to be stopped at all cost. Britain used to remain aloof from continent's politics. But whenever it felt that in the continent there could be a rise of a rival power, then Britain always interfered. The rise of Russia was now visible from Britain, and therefore it felt that it has to interfere to prevent the rise of Russians. Austrian Empire, which was otherwise having friendly relations with Russia, also secretly did not want Russians to advance at the cost of Ottomans. If Russians would advance southwards, it would bring them more and more closer to the Austrian frontiers. Consequently, there would be rise of nationalism amongst the Serbs within the Austrian Empire. Serbs, like Russians, were fellow Slavs. The rise of Russia in the vicinity could spark off Slav nationalism within the Austrian Empire and lead to conflicts, which ultimately did happen before World War I. And therefore, Austria also did not want Russians to advance in their direction. Around this time, there was also a conflict between France and Russia over projecting their respective power in the Middle East region. Both of them wanted to show that they were the champions of Christianity as such. France at this time was ruled by Napoleon III. He was the nephew of the first Napoleon. Napoleon III politically branded himself as the protector of the Catholics. In the wake of the French Revolution's excesses against the church, Napoleon III had used this tactic. He had promised protection to the papal states in Rome. In this context, Napoleon III wanted to be the protector of Christians in the Holy Lands. Yes, the lands of modern-day Israel, Palestine, Syria, where a lot of Christians lived, those lands had been contested between the Muslims and Christians for several centuries. Several crusades had also been fought over these holy lands. But one Muslim dynasty or the other had controlled these lands, and the Ottomans were the last to do so. During the Ottoman rule, French wanted to be the protectors of the rights of Catholics in Holy Lands. Russians, on the other hand, as practitioners of the Orthodox Church, they felt that they should have the rights over the Orthodox Christians. Now, Catholics and Orthodox, these are two sects in the Christianity. Around 1000 AD, somewhere around this time, we see that Christian church got split into these two wings, the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Orthodox Greek Church in the east. Subsequently, the Byzantine Empire and the Russian Empire, they adhered to the Orthodox Greek Church, whereas the other part of Europe, the western part, came under influence of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, here in the Holy Land, there were several important religious places for the Christians. Now, there were disputes within the Christians over custody of these holy places. The Orthodox Christians made their claim over these territories, these places, and so did the Roman Catholic Christians. France sided with the Roman Catholics, whereas the Russians, they sided with the Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Greek Christians. Both of these parties reached out to the Ottoman as protectors of Christians in the Holy Lands. The Ottoman ruler accepted the French position and considered him as the protector of the Christians in his land, including all Christians. This naturally would mean that the Roman Catholics will have the control over religious sites. It led to conflict between Russia and the Ottomans. Russians threatened the Ottomans that if they are not given this status, then they will invade Ottoman territories in their northern part, that is in the Balkan areas. Ottomans were assured by Britain and France that if such an invasion happens, then we will stand by you. Emboldened by this, Ottomans stuck to their promise with the French, and the Russians in return invaded the northern areas of Moldavia and Wallachia, which is now modern-day Romania. These areas were invaded by Russians, and this will start the Crimean War. This starts the Crimean War. Peace negotiations were attempted, but when nothing worked out, the war was waged. Ottomans fought, and Britain and France also soon sent their armies to Ottoman territories to fight in 1854. This is how the Crimean War will be started. Now, this begs the question, why did Britain and France, who were traditional enemies, who were competitors, who had fought so many wars with each other, why did they come together on this issue of the Crimean War? Let us try to understand that. Although both of them are arch enemies, but they are also pragmatic, states. They understood that they face a common threat, that is Russia, which could not be defeated by any one of them singularly. In fact, even when they tried to pool their resources together, they were not in any position to defeat the Russians, who had a much more mighty army. The Russians had a huge army of more than 6 lakh troops in those times, all accumulated. Britain and France could not muster that kind of a strength, and relied on other states, Ottomans and other neutral states, to actually defeat Russia. And hence, they were actually forced to, accept each other as allies in this war. They wanted to prevent each other gaining too much in Russia also. While both of them are allies, at the same time, that inner bitter rivalry is also going on. Each one of them is determined to prevent that the other does not gain substantially in this process, and both of them remain even Stevens in this part of Eastern Europe. Britain also additionally wanted to protect India, as Russia was a threat. We have seen how Peter the Great had clearly mentioned that to all his subsequent people who would succeed him to the throne, that they should aspire for India. Britain naturally wanted to curb the rise of Russia. France had its own interest in Middle East and Ottoman areas. Consequently, they have their own ambitions at the cost of Russia and Ottomans. And therefore, they feel it is necessary to come together. So they come together with a limited set of goals. What were these goals? Number one, to remove Russian protectorate over Ottoman vessels in northern part of empire. Those areas of Moldavia and Wallachia where Russians had influence, they want it to be removed. The river Danube passed through that area, and it was the lifeline of trade for Austrian Empire and many other adjoining areas. And consequently, Russian influence in this region was seen as a threat. So they wanted to remove Russian protectorate. Remove Russian protectorate over Orthodox Christians in Ottoman areas where Russians had always claimed protection of to be protecting the Orthodox Christians. France wanted to remove that. They also wanted to remove Russian obstruction on the Danube River trade. This was a very lucrative trade and very important trade lifeline for that region. Russia had monopolized it. They wanted to remove it. Limit Russian naval strength in the Black Sea. The area of Black Sea, the Black Sea itself is a very crucial area for this region's geopolitics as well as for trade. The person who has control over Black Sea is ultimately able to control the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the straits around Turkey, modern day Turkey, and through those straits is able to have access to the Mediterranean Sea also. This would make that state have great advantage over the Ottomans too. And hence, Britain and France at any cost want to prevent Russian influence in the Black Sea region. With these key strategic aims, both the sides will enter into the war. They sent their troops via the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, first to Varna, but by then the Ottomans had defeated the Russians at Silistra. An Austrian threat had made the Russians withdraw from the northern territories. But Britain and France thought it opportune to actually divert their troops to other parts so that Russians could be comprehensively defeated and their strategic goals could be met. This will lead them to this peninsula of Crimea. Here in Crimea, the big prize was the port of Sevastopol. He who controlled Sevastopol had Crimea, and he who had Crimea had domination over the Black Sea, and who had Black Sea had these straits over here, Bosphorus and Dardanelles straits, and through that one can get access to the Mediterranean Sea via the Aegean Sea. So this was a very big game that had to be won by Britain and France if they wanted to control the increasing influence of Russian Empire. This will lead to the invasion of Crimea. All right. So why was the invasion of Crimea mounted? To prevent Russian expansion towards the east, control over Black Sea, especially capturing the port of Sevastopol so that Black Sea can be controlled, preventing Russia from dominating in the Black Sea straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, and keeping Ottomans strong against Russians. It was very clear that Russians will continue to nurse this ambition, and the Ottomans have to be propped up. They have to be supported so that they will be in some position to resist the Russian advance. Britain and France could not always be present here in this area. Ultimately, it had to be Ottomans who had to defend against the rise of Russians. So for that, they want Ottomans to be strong, and for Ottomans to be strong, Black Sea has to be free from Russian control. For all of these strategic imperatives, Britain and France will have to invade Crimea. All right. Now, this war from 1854 till 1856, it will drag on and will not have very conclusive results as such. Although the Russian army was much more backward as compared to the British and French, but it had advantage of numbers. It had its hinterland for supplies. Britain and France were much more advanced, but then there were a lot of conflicts between the two. There was the issue of supply lines. This was not their home ground as such, and consequently, they too faced many disadvantages. In this process, Britain and France knew that if they can prolong the war sufficiently, then it will have an effect on Russian economy. Russia will have to decide between a humiliation at foreign powers or complete destruction of its economy. After a certain point, rationality will lead the Russians to accept that humiliation to prevent the rout of the economy. This was very clear. So Britain and France, they too dragged on in this war, suffered losses themselves too, but then hoped that towards the end, Russians will have to surrender. Russian military was clearly no match to the advanced British and French troops. British and French troops were better armed, better trained. They had better rifles. The same rifles which will be introduced in India, known as the Enfield rifles, which caused a lot of havoc before the revolt of 1857, those gave a big strategic advantage to British troops over here. Russians, on the other hand, were still using musketry type of guns, which were no match to the British rifles. Finally, Russians decided that they could not continue any further. Their situation was not tenable, and they came to terms with Britain and France in the Treaty of Paris. In this Treaty of Paris, signed in 1856, independence and territorial integrity of Turkey was guaranteed. This was a big strategic goal for Britain and France to keep Turkey or Ottoman Turkey alive. This was necessary to prevent Russian advancement towards Mediterranean, towards other parts of West Asia. Orthodox control on churches, on the other hand, was conceded. Orthodox control will be there on the churches. Ottomans and Russians, they returned each other's territories that had been captured, and a status quo ante was established. Abandoning maintaining of fortified ports and warships in the Black Sea. Black Sea had to be completely neutralized, and no side will be allowed to have fortified ports and warships in Black Sea. This was another major goal of the British and the French, to ensure that Russians are not able to dominate the Black Sea. The Danube River trade was opened for all powers. This was again a great commercial victory for Britain and France. Austria also gained from this at the cost of Russian privilege. In 1870, although this war ends with a treaty favorable to Western powers, Ottoman Turkey is able to survive at the end of this war. But then soon the wheels of history will again start to turn fast. Russians repudiated most of these terms, and then they will fight another war with Ottoman Turkey in 1877. In 1877, Russians will defeat the Ottomans, and a lot of the advantages that it had earlier, they will be taken away. This time, Britain and France will not come to the aid and rescue of Ottomans, and consequently, Russians will be able to overpower them. Many wondered what actually was the benefit of this war when finally, a few decades down the line, Russians were able to get a lot of what they had actually wanted or hoped for. Characteristics of the war. The war from the start was plagued with poor planning and logistics. Throughout the war, there were a lot of goof-ups on the sides of the British and French, and also the Russians. In this campaign, there were many episodes where the British troops suffered from a big loss or defeat. The charge of the Light Brigade is one such episode where, because of miscommunication, a British cavalry unit charged directly at artillery of the Russians, which was very well entrenched. And they were like right away running into the face of death. Many of the troops of Britishers were lost. Many of their horses were killed in the process. That was all because of poor command, poor communication during that war. In this war, many British officers from India also served. I told you I'll tell you some connect with India. One of that was the Enfield Rifles, and second was some legendary British officers who served in the Crimean War who will come to serve again back in India. Sir Colin Campbell, who will get back Lucknow during revolt of 1857, served in this war. He was battle hardened from Crimea. So did Sir Hugh Rose, who defeated Rani of Jhansi, who defeated Nana Sahib. He was the officer who had fought in the Crimean War and had come back to India in the course of revolt of 1857. So many such British officials, they cut their teeth in the Crimean War and they again came back to India and participated in the revolt of 1857 after that. Huge number of deaths were reported in the war. And surprisingly, not because of gun wounds or because of mortars, shellings and stuff like that. 2/3 of the people who died, the soldiers who died roundabout, they died not because of the war itself, but because of disease. Poor sanitation, lack of health care led to most of the deaths. The number of deaths in the hospitals was much higher than on the actual battle front. Telegraph was used for the first time in warfare in this war. Later, it will prove to be a boon for the Britishers in the revolt of 1857 also. Railway lines were also drawn to ensure smooth supply of food, ration and other things to the troops. In the Crimean Peninsula, the Britishers drew railway line. Photography was also used to capture the events of the war. A correspondent of London Times was present as war correspondent, a post that was started in this war. This was the first war that was brought to people's homes through newspapers and magazines. People could see the photos, they could hear and they could read the news that was happening over there, and the poor condition, loss of lives, all of this had led to a big outrage in Britain and France. In fact, in Britain, the public pressure was so high to stop the war that a government fell and a new government had to be brought in because of this public pressure. This war is also a modern war in the sense that it marked many advances in terms of the weapons that were used. Not only were the Enfield rifles new, but also assault vessels were used for the first time to take troops to the ports in Crimea. Professional nursing also develops from this war. Florence Nightingale played a very crucial role in developing the standards of nursing and sanitation in the course of this war. Because of her single-minded focus and dedication, many lives could be saved. In the second part of the war, the death rate in the hospitals came down substantially because of the standards that Florence Nightingale developed. Interestingly, guys, although Florence Nightingale did not come to India, she, through her pressure, ensured that in British India also, the standards of the hospital were raised, the sanitation and everything was maintained at top-notch level, and that had a big impact on healthcare in India also. Although she didn't visit, but then she did create an effect in India too. Next round of one more reform. Armed forces were reformed because of the losses in the war. And one interesting thing that was introduced was the Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross was a gallantry award, the highest gallantry award for a British trooper or a soldier officer. Irrespective of the rank, this is the highest award that a person could win, and that VC or Victoria Cross continues till this date in Britain. Many Indians serving for the Britishers have won Victoria Crosses. Next round of conflict will take place in 1877, as I told you earlier. Russians this time will be able to take back a lot of territory from the Ottomans. So this was a war, guys, with many unique characteristics, and it played a very crucial role in the development of 19th century history. If you see closely, this war is driven because of the mindset of the Russian ruler, and that mindset is because of the geography of Russia. From Peter the Great to Putin the Great, it is that same mindset. When Putin wants to have control over Ukraine, I'm not justifying or condoning the war as such, but then the idea behind that is when Ukraine applies to become part of NATO, it is going to ruffle up Moscow. And to prevent that, this particular type of effort is taken by Russia. So that has to be understood in the larger geopolitical matrix of things. I hope you found this lecture enjoyable and you learned something new out of it. If you watched it thus far, I'm sure you found a lot of value in it. Do like this video, leave some love in the comment box and share this with your friends. I'll see you in my next video on some such international world history related discussion. Thank you very much.